Shalom, everyone. I hope you all having a wonderful day so far. So this subject is going to be about Joseph's rise out of persecution. So this is a continuation of the reading from the book of Jasher. So this is going to be from Jasher chapter 48 through the end of Jasher chapter 50. So this will be the continuation from the last video, which talked about Joseph's persecution. You know, how he was sold into slavery by his brothers and how he went to Egypt and, ended up going to prison because of being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and stuff like that. You know, all of that was from the previous video. So now this is going to be about Joseph's rise out of persecution. So this is going to be from how Joseph went out of prison and ended up ruling over the land of Egypt under Potiphar the Pharaoh. So now I'm going to do this reading, and I hope you all enjoy this wonderful message, and let me know if you have any questions. Chapter 48 from the book of Jasher. In those days, after the death of Isaac, Yahuwah commanded and caused a scarcity of food on the whole earth. At that time, Pharaoh, the sovereign of Egypt, was sitting on his throne in the land of Egypt and lay in his bed and dreamed dreams. And Pharaoh saw in his dream that he was standing by a bank of the river of Egypt. And while he was standing, he looked and see 7 fat and fine-looking cows came up out of the river, and 7 other cows, lean of flesh and ugly, came up after them, and the 7 ugly ones swallowed up the fine-looking ones, but their appearance was still ugly as first. And he awoke and slept again and dreamed a second time. And he looked and see 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, complete and good, and 7 lean heads scorched by the east wind sprang up after them, and the lean heads swallowed up the full ones, and Pharaoh awoke out of his dream. And in the morning the sovereign remembered his dreams, and his spirit was sadly troubled because of his dreams. And the sovereign hastened and sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and the wise men. They came and stood before Pharaoh. And sovereign said to them, I have dreamed dreams. There is none to interpret them. And they said to the sovereign, relate your dreams to your servants and let us hear them. And the sovereign related his dreams to them, and they all answered and said with one voice to the sovereign, may the sovereign live forever. And this is the interpretation of your dreams. The 7 good cows which you saw signify 7 daughters that would be born to you in the latter days. And the 7 cows which you saw came up after them and swallowed them up are for a sign that the daughters which will be born to you will all die in the lifetime of the sovereign. And that which you saw in the second dream of 7 complete good heads of grain coming up on one stalk, this is their interpretation, that you will build for yourself in the latter days 7 cities throughout the land of Egypt. And that which you saw is 7 blasted heads of grain springing up after them and swallowing them up while you saw them with your eyes, is a sign that the cities which you will build will all be destroyed in the latter days in the lifetime of the sovereign. And when they spoke these words, the sovereign did not incline his ear to their words, neither did he fix his heart on them. For the sovereign knew in his wisdom that they did not give a proper interpretation of the dreams. And when they had finished speaking before the sovereign answered them, saying, what is this matter that you have spoken to me? Indeed, you have spoken falsehood and spoken lies. Now therefore give the proper interpretation of my dreams, that you may not die. And the sovereign commanded after this, he sent and called again for other wise men, and they came and stood before the sovereign. And the sovereign related his dreams to them, and they all answered him according to the first interpretation. And the sovereign's wrath was kindled, and he was very wroth. And the sovereign said to them, Indeed, you speak lies and speak falsehood in what you have said. And the sovereign commanded that a decree should be made throughout the land of Egypt, saying, It is determined by the sovereign and his great men that any wise man who knows and understands the interpretation of dreams, then will not come before the sovereign this day, shall die. And to the man that will declare to the sovereign the proper interpretation of his dreams, there shall be given him all that he will require from the sovereign. And all the wise men of the land of Egypt came before the sovereign, together with all the magicians and sorcerers that were in Egypt, and in Goshen, and in Ramesses, and in Taphanes, and in Sor, and all the places on the borders of Egypt. And they all stood before the sovereign. And all the nobles and princes and all the attendants belonging to the sovereign came together from all the cities of Egypt, and they all sat before the sovereign. And the sovereign related his dreams before the wise men, and the princes and all that sat before the sovereign were astonished at the vision. And all the wise men who were before the sovereign were greatly divided in their interpretation of his dreams. Some of them interpreted to the sovereign, saying, The 7 good cows are 7 sovereigns, and whom the sovereign issue will be raised over Egypt, and the 7 ugly cows are 7 princes that will stand up against them in the latter days and destroy them. And the 7 heads of grain are the 7 great princes belonging to Egypt, who will fall into the hands of 7 less powerful princes of their enemies in the battles of our master the sovereign. And some of them interpreted to the sovereign in this manner, saying, The 7 good cows are strong cities in Egypt, and the 7 ugly cows are the 7 nations of the land of Canaan, who will come against the 7 cities in Egypt in the latter days and destroy them. And that which you saw in the second dream of the 7 good and bad heads of grain is a sign that the reign of Egypt will again return to your seed as at first. And in his reign, the people of the cities of Egypt will turn against the 7 cities of Canaan, who are stronger than they are, and will destroy them. And the reign of Egypt will return to your seed. And some of them said to the sovereign, This is the interpretation of your dreams. The 7 good cows are 7 sovereignesses, and whom you will take for wives in the latter days, and the 7 ugly cows signify those women will all die in the lifetime of the sovereign. And the 7 good and bad heads of grain which you saw in the second dream are 14 children, and it will be in the latter days that they will stand up and fight amongst themselves, and 7 of them will smite the 7 that are more powerful. And some of them spoke these words to the sovereign, saying, The 7 good cows signify the 7 children will be born to you, but they will slay 7 of your children in the last days. And the 7 good heads of grain which you saw in the second dream are those princes against whom 7 other less powerful princes will fight and destroy them in the latter days, and avenge your children's cause, and the reign will again return to your seed. And the sovereign heard all the words of the wise men of Egypt and their interpretation of his dreams, but none of them pleased the sovereign. And the sovereign knew in his wisdom that they did not altogether speak rightly in all these words, for this was from Yahuwah to overturn the words of the wise men of Egypt, in order that Joseph might go out from prison, in order that he should become great in Egypt. And the sovereign saw that none among all wise men and magicians of Egypt spoke rightly to him, and the sovereign's wrath was kindled, and his wrath was burned within him. And the sovereign commanded that all the wise men and magicians should go out from before him, and they all went out from before the sovereign with shame and disgrace. And the sovereign commanded that a decree be sent throughout Egypt to slay all the magicians that were in Egypt, and not one of them should be allowed to live. And the captain of the guards belonging to the sovereign rose up, and each man drew his sword, and they all began to smite the magicians of Egypt and the wise men. And after this, Merod, the chief cupbearer to the sovereign, came and bowed down before the sovereign and sat before him. And the cupbearer said to the sovereign, May the sovereign live forever and his reign exalted in the land. You were wroth with your servant in those days. Now 2 years past, placed me in confinement, and I was for some time in confinement, the chief baker and I. And there was with us a Hebrew servant belonging to the captain of the guard. His name is Joseph, for his master had been wroth with him and placed him in prison, and he attended us there. And in some time after, when we were in confinement, we dreamed dreams in one night, and the chief baker and I, we dreamed, each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And we came in the morning and told them to that servant, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he rightly interpreted. And it came to be as he interpreted to us, so was the event, and they were not any of his words that fell to the ground. Now therefore, my master and sovereign, do not slay the people of Egypt for naught. See that slave is still in prison in the house by the captain of the guard, his master in prison. If it pleases the sovereign, let him send for him that he may come before you, and that he will make known to you the right interpretation of the dream which you dreamed. And the sovereign heard the words of the chief cupbearer, and the sovereign ordered the wise men of Egypt should not be slain. And the sovereign ordered his servants to bring Joseph before him, and the sovereign said to him, Go to him and do not frighten him, lest he be confused and will not know how to speak properly. And the servants of the sovereign went to Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and the sovereign's servants shaved him and changed his prison garment, and he came before the sovereign. And the sovereign was sitting on his royal throne in a princely dress girded around the golden shoulder garment, and fine gold which was on it sparkled, and the emerald and the ruby and the turquoise, together with all the precious stones that were on the sovereign's head, dazzled the eye. And Joseph wondered greatly at the sovereign. And the throne on which the sovereign sat was covered with gold and silver and with shoham stones, and it had 70 steps. It was their custom throughout the land of Egypt that every man who came to speak to the sovereign, if he was a prince or one that was esteemed in the sight of the sovereign, he went up to the sovereign's throne as far as the 31st step, and the sovereign would go down to the 36th step to speak with him. If he was one of the common people, he went up to the 3rd step, and the sovereign will go down to the 4th and speak with him. And their custom was, moreover, that any man who understood to speak in all 70 languages, he went up to 70 steps and went until he reached the sovereign and spoke. And any man who could not complete the 70, he went up as many steps as the languages in which he knew to speak in. And it was customary in those days in Egypt that no one should reign over them, but he who understood to speak in 70 languages. And when Joseph came before the sovereign, he bowed down to the ground before the sovereign. He went up to the 3rd step, and the sovereign sat on the 4th step and spoke with Joseph. And the sovereign said to Joseph, I dreamed a dream, and there was no interpreter to interpret it properly. I commanded this day that all the magicians of Egypt and the wise men thereof should come before me, and I related my dreams to them, and no one has properly interpreted them to me. And after this, I heard this day concerning you that you are a wise man and can rightly interpret every dream that you hear. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, Let Pharaoh relate his dreams that he dreamed. Indeed, the interpretations belong to Yahuwah. And Pharaoh related his dreams to Joseph, and he dreamed the cows and the dreams of the heads of grain. And the sovereign said no more. And the Joseph was then clothed in the ruach of Yahuwah before the sovereign, and he knew all the matters that would befall the sovereign from that day on, and he knew the right interpretation of the sovereign's dream, and he spoke before the sovereign. And Joseph found favor in the sight of the sovereign, and the sovereign inclined his ears and his heart, and he heard all the words of Joseph. And Joseph said to the sovereign, do not think that they are two dreams, for it is only one dream. For that which Yahuwah has chosen to do throughout the land, he has shown to the sovereign in his dream, and this is the right interpretation of the dream. The 7 good cows and heads of grain are 7 years, and the 7 ugly cows and heads of grain are also 7 years. It is one dream. And see, in the 7 years that are coming, there will be a great plenty throughout the land, and after that it be 7 years of scarcity of food will follow them, a very grievous scarcity of food, and all the plenty will be forgotten from the land, and the scarcity of food will consume the inhabitants of land. The sovereign dreamed one dream, and the dream was therefore repeated to Pharaoh, because the matter is established by Yahuwah, and Yahuwah will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore I will give you counsel, and deliver your beings and the beings of the inhabitants of the land from the evil of the scarcity of food, and that you seek throughout your reign for a man very discerning and wise, who knows all the affairs of a reign, and appoint him as an overseer over the land of Egypt. And let the man whom you place over Egypt appoint officers under him, and that they gather and all the food in the good years that are coming, and let them lay up grain and deposit in your appointed stores, and let them keep that food for 70 years of scarcity of food, that it may be found for you and your people and your whole land, that you and your land it will not be cut off by scarcity of food. Let all the inhabitants of the land, every man also, be ordered that they gather in the produce of his field and the kinds of food during the 7 good years, and they place it in their stores, and that it may be found for them in the days of the scarcity of food, and that they may live on it. And this is the proper interpretation of your dream, and this is the counsel given to save your being and the being of all your subjects. And the sovereign answered and said to Joseph, who says and who knows that your words are right? And he said to the sovereign, this shall be a sign to you regarding all my words, that they are true and that my advice is good for you. Behold, your wife sits this day upon the birth stool, and she will bear you a son, and your will rejoice with him, and that your child shall have come out from his mother's womb, your firstborn son, that have been born 2 years ago shall die, and that you'll be comforted in that child, that which will be born to you this day. And Joseph finished speaking those words to the sovereign, and he bowed down to the sovereign, and he went out. And when Joseph is gone out from the sovereign's presence, the signs which Joseph has spoken to the sovereign came to be on that day. And the sovereignesses bore a son on that day, and the sovereign heard the good news about his son, and he rejoiced. And when the reporter is gone out from the sovereign's presence, the sovereigns found the firstborn son of the sovereign fallen dead on the ground. And there was a great lamentation and noise in the sovereign's house, and the sovereign heard it. And he said, what is this noise and lamentation that I heard in the house? And they told the sovereign that the firstborn son had died, and the sovereign knew that all of Joseph's words that he had spoken were true. And the sovereign was comforted for his son by the child that was born to him on that day, as Joseph had spoken. Chapter 49. After these matters, the sovereign sent and assembled all his officers and sovereigns and all the princes and nobles of the sovereign. They all came before the sovereign. And the sovereign said to them, look, you have seen and heard all the words of this Hebrew, and all the signs which he declared would come to be, and not any of his words fall into the ground. You know that he was given a right interpretation of the dream, and it will indeed come to be so. Now therefore take counsel, and know that you will do how the land will be delivered from the scarcity of food. Seek now and see whether the light can be found, and whose heart there is wisdom and knowledge, and I will appoint him over the land. For you have heard the Hebrew had advised concerning this to save the land from the scarcity of food. And I know that the land will not be delivered from the scarcity of food except by the advice of the Hebrew, him that he advised me. And all that answered the sovereign and said, the counsel which the Hebrew have given concerning this is good. Now therefore, our master and sovereign, see the whole land is in your hand. Do which is seemed good in your eyes. And he whom you choose, whom you in your wisdom knows to be wise and capable of delivering the land with his wisdom, him shall be the sovereign appointed to be under him in the land. And the sovereign said to all the officers, I have thought that since Yahuwah has made known to the Hebrew all that he has spoken, there is none so discerning and wise in the whole land as he is. If it seems good in your eyes, I'll place him over the land, for he will save the land with his wisdom. And all the officers answered the sovereign and said, but indeed it is written in the laws of Egypt that it should not be violated, that no man should reign over Egypt, nor that be the second to the sovereign, but one who has knowledge of all the languages of the sons of men. Now therefore, our master and sovereign, see, this Hebrew can only speak the Hebrew language. How then can he be over us and second under reign, a man who not even knows our language? Now please send for him and let him come before you and prove him all matters and do as you see fit. And the sovereign said, it shall be done tomorrow. The word that you have spoken is good. And all the officers came on that day before the sovereign. And on the night Yahuwah sent one of his ministering messengers, and he came into the land of Egypt to Joseph. And the messenger of Yahuwah stood over Joseph, and see, Joseph was laying in bed at night in his master's house in the dungeon, for his master has put him back into the dungeon because of his wife. And the messenger roused him from his sleep, and Joseph rose up and stood on his feet, and see, the messenger of Yahuwah was standing opposite to him. And the messenger of Yahuwah spoke with Joseph, and he taught him all the languages of man in that night, and he called his name Yahuseph. And the messenger of Yahuwah went from him, and Joseph returned and laid on his bed, and Joseph was astonished at the vision which he saw. And it came to be in the morning that the sovereign sent for all his officers and servants, and they all came and sat before the sovereign. And the sovereign ordered Joseph to be brought, and the sovereign's servants went and brought Joseph before the Pharaoh. And the sovereign came out and went up the steps of the throne, and Joseph spoke to the sovereign in all languages. And Joseph went up to him and spoke to the sovereign till he arrived before the sovereign on the 70th step, and he sat before the sovereign. And the sovereign greatly rejoiced because of Joseph, and all the sovereign's officers rejoiced greatly with the sovereign when they heard all the words of Joseph. The word seems good in the eyes of the sovereign and the officers to appoint Joseph to be the second to the sovereign over the whole land of Egypt. And the sovereign spoke to Joseph, saying, now you gave me counsel to appoint a wise man over the land of Egypt, in order that his wisdom to save the land from the scarcity of food. Now therefore, since Yahuwah has made all this known to you, and all the words which you have spoken throughout the land, there is not a discerning and wise man like you. And no more shall your name be called Joseph, but Sapanath Pani shall be your name, and you shall be second to me. And according to your word shall be all the affairs of my reign, and your word shall my people go out and come in. And from under your hand shall my servant and officers receive their salary, which is given to them monthly. And to you shall all the people of the land bow down. Only in my throne will I be greater than you. And the sovereign took off his ring from his head and put it on, or from his hand, and put it on the hand of Joseph. And the sovereign dressed Joseph in a princely garment, and he put a golden crown upon his head, and he put a golden chain on his neck. And the sovereign commanded his servants, and they made him ride the second chariot belonging to the sovereign. And they went opposite to the sovereign's chariot, and he caused him to ride upon a great and strong horse from the sovereign's horses, and conducted through the streets of the land of Egypt. And the sovereign commanded that all those that played on timbrels, harps, and other musical instruments should go out with Joseph, 1,000 timbrels and 1,000 dancers and 1,000 lyres went out after them. And 5,000 men with drawn swords glittering in their hands, and they went marching and playing before Joseph, and 20,000 of the great men of the sovereign, girded with the girdles of skin covered with gold, and marched at the right hand of Joseph, 20,000 at his left. And all the women and maidens went up on the roofs and stood on the streets, playing and rejoicing at Joseph, and gazed at the appearance of Joseph and his good looks. And the sovereign's people went before him and behind him, perfuming the way with frankincense and with cassia, and with all kinds of fine perfume, and scattered myrrh and aloes along the way. And 20 men proclaimed these words before him throughout the land in a loud voice: Do you see the man whom the sovereign has chosen to be his second? All the affairs of the reign shall be governed by him, and he that transgresses his orders, or that does not bow down before him to the ground, shall die. For he rebels against the sovereign and his second. And the heralds had ceased proclaiming. All the people of Egypt bowed down to the ground before Joseph and said, May the sovereign live, and also may his second live. And all the inhabitants of Egypt bowed down along the way. When the heralds approached him, they bowed down, and they rejoiced at all kinds of timbrels, flutes, and lyres before Joseph. And on his horse Joseph lifted up his eyes to the heavens and called out and said, He raises a poor man from the dust, he lifts up the needy from the dunghill. O Yahuwah of hosts, favored is the man who trusts in you. And Joseph passed throughout the land of Egypt with Pharaoh's servants and officers, and they showed him the whole land of Egypt and all the sovereign's treasures. And Joseph returned and came on that day before Pharaoh. And the sovereign gave to Joseph a possession in the land of Egypt, a possession of field and vineyards. And sovereign gave to Joseph 3,000 kikars of silver and 1,000 kikars of gold, and shoham stones and bdellium and many gifts. And on the next day the sovereign commanded all the people of Egypt to bring Joseph offerings and gifts, and that he violated the command of the sovereign should die. And they made a high place in the street of the city, and they spread out garments there. And whoever brought anything to Joseph put it unto the high place. And all the people of Egypt threw something unto the high place, one man a golden earring, another rings and amulets, and different vessels of gold and silver work, and shoham stones and bdellium he cast upon the high place, and every one gave something of what he possessed. And Joseph took all these and placed them in his treasuries. And all the officers and nobles belonging to the sovereign exalted Joseph, and they gave him many gifts, seeing that the sovereign had chosen him to be a second. And the sovereign sent to Potipharah, the son of Ahiram, the priest of On. He took his younger daughter Asenath and gave her to Joseph for a wife. And the maiden was very lovely, a maiden, one whom a man had not known. Joseph took her as wife. And the sovereign said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, because you none shall dare lift up his hand or his foot to govern my people throughout the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. And Joseph went out from before the sovereign, and he became the sovereign's second in Egypt. And the sovereign gave Joseph 100 servants to attend him in his house. And Joseph also sent and purchased many servants, and they remained in the house of Joseph. And Joseph then built for himself a very magnificent house, like the houses of sovereigns, before the court of the sovereign's palace. He made in a house a large palace, very elegant in appearance and spacious for his dwelling. And Joseph was 3 years in building the house. Joseph made for himself a very elegant throne of a great amount of gold and silver. He covered it with shoam stones of bdellium, and he made it on the likeness of the whole land of Egypt, and the likenesses of the river of Egypt, and the waters of the whole land of Egypt. And Joseph sat safely upon his throne in the house, and Yahuwah increased Joseph's wisdom. And all the inhabitants of Egypt and Pharaoh's servants and his princes loved Joseph exceedingly, for this matter was from Yahuwah to Joseph. And Joseph had an army that fought and going out in companies and divisions to a number of 40,600 men, capable of bearing arms to assist the sovereign and Joseph against the enemy, besides the sovereign's officers and his servants and the inhabitants of Egypt without number. And Joseph gave to his mighty men and all his army shields and spears and helmets and scaled armor and stones for slinging. Chapter 50. This will be the last chapter. At that time, the children of Tarshish came out against the sons of Ishmael and fought against them, and the children of Tarshish plundered the Ishmaelites for a long time. And the children of Ishmael were small in number in those days, and they could not prevail over the children of Tarshish, and they were bitterly oppressed. And the old man of the Ishmaelites sent a record to the sovereign of Egypt, saying, Please send to your servants, officers, and armies to help us fight against the children of Tarshish, for we have been consuming away for a long time. And Pharaoh sent Joseph with mighty men and the army that were with him, and also his mighty men from the sovereign's house. And they went to the land of Hawilah and to the children of Ishmael to assist them against the children of Tarshish. And the children of Ishmael fought with the children of Tarshish, and Joseph smote the Tarshites, and he subdued all their land, and the children of Ishmael dwelt there this day. And the land of Tarshish was subdued, and the Tarshites ran away and came to the border of their brothers and children of Yawan or Greece. And Joseph and all his mighty men and all the army returned to Egypt, not one man of them missing. And at the turn of the year, in the second year of Joseph's reigning over Egypt, Yahuwah gave great plenty throughout the land 7 years, as Joseph had spoken. For Yahuwah favored all the produce of the earth in those days for 7 years, and they ate and were greatly satisfied. And Joseph at that time had officers under him, and they collected all the food for the good years and heaped up grain year by year, and they placed it in the storehouses of Joseph. And at any time when they gathered the food, Joseph commanded that they should bring the grain in the heads, and they also bring it with some of the soil of the field, that it should not spoil. And Joseph did according to this year by year. He heaped up large quantities of grain like the sand of the sea, for his stores were immersed, and such great amount that could not be numbered. And all the inhabitants of Egypt gathered all kinds of food in their stores in great quantities during the 7 good years, but they did not do to it as Joseph did. And all the food which Joseph and the Egyptians had gathered throughout the 7 years of plenty were secured for the land and stores for 7 years of scarcity of food for the support of the whole land. And each man of the inhabitants of Egypt filled his store and his council placed with grain to be for food during the scarcity of food. And Joseph placed all the food that he had gathered in all the cities of Egypt. When he closed all the stores, he placed watchmen over them. And Joseph's wife Asenath and the daughter of Potipharah bore him 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Joseph was 34 years old when he brought them forth. And the youths grow up, and they went his ways and his Torah, and did not deviate from the way which their father taught them, either to the right or left. And Yahuwah was in the youths, and they grew up and had understanding and skill, and all the wisdom, and all the affairs of the reign, and all the sovereign's officers, and his great men, and of the inhabitants of Egypt exalted the lads, and they were brought up among the sovereign's children. And the 7 years of plenty were throughout the land were at an end, and the 7 years of scarcity of food came after them, as Joseph has spoken. And the scarcity of food was throughout the land. And all the people of Egypt saw that all the scarcity of food had begun in the land of Egypt, and all the people of Egypt opened their stores of grain, for the scarcity of food was severe upon them. And they found all the food that was in their stores full of rats and not fit to eat, and the scarcity of food was severe throughout the land. And all the inhabitants of Egypt came and cried before Pharaoh, for the scarcity of food was heavy upon them. And they said to Pharaoh, "Give food to your servants. Why shall we die through hunger before your eyes, even we and our little ones?" And Pharaoh answered them, saying, "And why do you cry to me? Did Joseph not command that the grain should be laid up during the 7 years of plenty, for the years of scarcity of food? Why did you not listen to his voice?" And the people of Egypt answered the sovereign, saying, "As your being lives, our master, our servants have done all that Joseph ordered. For your servants also gathered in all the produce of their field during the 7 years of plenty, and laid it in the stores to this day. And when the scarcity of food was severe on your servants, we opened our stores, and look, all our produce was filled with rats and was not fit for food." And when the sovereign heard all that befallen the inhabitants of Egypt, the sovereign was greatly afraid because of the scarcity of food. And he feared greatly. And the sovereign answered the people of Egypt, saying, "Since all this has come upon you, go to Joseph and do whatever he shall say to you, and do not transgress his commands." And all the people of Egypt went out and came to Joseph and said to him, "Give food to us. Why should we die before you from hunger? For we gathered in our produce during the 7 years as you commanded, and we put it in store, and thus has it befallen us." And when Joseph heard all the words of the people of Egypt and what had befallen them, Joseph opened all his stores of the produce, and he sold it to the people of Egypt. And the scarcity of food was severe throughout the land, and the scarcity of food was in all the countries. But in the land of Egypt there was produce for sale. And all the inhabitants of Egypt came to Joseph to buy grain, for the scarcity of food was severe on them, for all their grain was spoiled. And Joseph daily sold it to all the people of Egypt. And all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan and the Philistines and beyond the Jordan, and the people and the children of the east, and all the cities of the land far and near, had heard that there was grain in Egypt, and they all came to Egypt to buy grain, for the scarcity of food was severe on them. And Joseph opened the stores of grain and placed officers over them, and they stood daily and sold all that came. And Joseph knew that his brothers would also come to Egypt to buy grain, and for the scarcity of food was severe throughout the earth. And Joseph commanded all his people that they should cause it to be proclaimed throughout the land of Egypt, saying, "It is the pleasure of the sovereign by a second and their great man, that any person who wishes to buy grain in Egypt shall not send his sovereign to Egypt to purchase, but to his sons. Also that any Egyptian or Canaanite who shall come from any of the stores from buying grain in Egypt shall go and sell it throughout the land. He shall die, for no one shall buy it but for the support of his household. And that any man leading 2 or 3 beasts shall die, for a man shall only lead his own beast." And Joseph placed watchmen at the gates of Egypt, and commanded them, saying, "Any person who may come to buy grain, do not allow him to be entered until his name and the name of his father and the name of his father's father be written down. And whatever is written by day, send their names to me in the evening, that I may know their names." And Joseph placed the officers throughout the land of Egypt, and he commanded them to do all these matters. And Joseph did all these matters and made these laws in order that he might know when his brothers should come to Egypt to buy grain. And Joseph's people caused it to be proclaimed daily in Egypt, according to these words and laws which Joseph has commanded. And all the inhabitants of the east and west country of all the earth heard the laws and regulations which Joseph has established in Egypt. The inhabitants of the ends of the earth came, and they bought grain in Egypt day after day, and they went away. And all the officers of Egypt did as Joseph has commanded, and all that came into Egypt to buy grain, the gatekeepers would write their names and their fathers' names and bring daily to them in the evening before Joseph. So that was it for chapter 50. So yes, I hope you all enjoyed this reading, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Shalom, everyone.